how does she just kind of vanish at this point in time? People don't just simply vanish. Uh, there's generally some kind of catalyst behind this. So,
Nearly 1 year after this Georgia woman vanishes without a trace, her remains are recovered more than 100 miles away in Tennessee.
this route is fraught with unpredictable outcomes here.
But the case has more questions than answers. Investigators still unclear how she died.
Over the course of my career, working with skeletal remains, most of the time, the investigators, the medical examiner, even, you're kind of left scratching your head in the end.
We can't even say for sure whether she was murdered.
But you can't just willy-nilly just randomly say, oh yeah, well, this was in fact a homicide, because you don't have anything scientifically to hang your proverbial hat on.
And then there's her eerie disappearance, canceling plans with her mom to accept a ride from a stranger.
Yeah, as an investigator, oh boy, I'd look at this long and hard. I don't think that it's necessarily coincidence.
Maury-Ange Faith Martinez would have turned 21 years old last week. But instead of making birthday plans to celebrate, her family is left in disbelief as her remains are recovered and identified a state away. Maury was last seen in August 2023. Her remains were recovered in January of this year, but they weren't officially identified until several months later. With that in mind, I reached out to forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan. So the reason I wanted to talk to you specifically in this case is that the remains were found many months ago back in January, but were just now identified. Why would it take so long to identify who they belong to?
Well, we think about in terms of skeletal remains. Um, First off, if that's what we're dealing with, and it certainly sounds like that's the case here, they're going to be degraded to the point where there will not be any kind of recognizable features. And I'll give you, for instance, the old days of people walking into a morgue and pulling a sheet back and seeing the face. That those days are certainly gone at this point. Um, we rely very heavily on science in order to get people identified, specifically DNA now more so than in the past. Of course, coupled still with dentistry, but you want to be sure, and that takes time. People want to speed this process up, but it takes time. So my thought is that with the medical examiner's office, they were in fact taking their time to make sure all of their bases are covered, because as sad as it is, there are more people out there missing than anyone can possibly even fathom. And you don't want to just jump to a conclusion when it comes to ID. You have to be very, very careful. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if you misidentified someone and went and notified somebody's family, and you didn't have 100% scientific surety with that?
Maury's remains were found in Chattanooga, Tennessee, but she was last seen about 130 miles south, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. There's been multiple reports about where Maury was last spotted. It was first reported that she was last seen northeast of Atlanta in Gwinnett County, being picked up from the jail there. But later, investigators determined she was actually last spotted in Cobb County, northwest of Atlanta. These reports say she was last seen being picked up from a courthouse building. It's still unclear why she would have been there or at the jail in the first place. But what we do know for sure is that Maury's mother was on her way to pick her up less than 10 minutes out when Maury texted her saying she'd found another ride. Her mom was actually supposed to go and pick her up. She was about 9 minutes away, according
Yep.
to her phone. She's about to get her
Yep.
daughter, and her daughter texts her and says, "Hey, I'm getting a ride from someone else." After that, she doesn't hear from her daughter again. She says that this is really out of character. Is that situation a red flag to you, or do you think it could be unrelated to her disappearance at all?
We have to consider where mom was going to pick her up, right? Um, it's been kind of fuzzy, some of the reports that are coming out. But when you think about going to a criminal justice complex or to a courthouse area, this sort of thing, well, what's going on there? Who do it's not like you're going, to the local flower club meeting or something like this. All right. The chance that you're going to cross paths with someone that might not mean you well increases exponentially, I think, given this environment. Even if this poor young lady has no association with them, you never know who's coming in and out of a complex like this. And so, yeah, as an investigator, oh boy, I'd look at this long and hard. I don't think that it's necessarily coincidence. Perhaps I don't believe in coincidences most of the time as a science guy. So that is an onion that the investigators will have to peel and consider. And with each contact that they make there relative to anybody that may have been there at that particular time, they have to press. There should be CCTV that's available within this complex and without. How does she just kind of vanish at this point in time? People don't just simply vanish. There's generally some kind of catalyst behind this. So, yeah, as an investigator, I'd take a long, hard look at that particular geographic location.
Let's pause the story of Maury-Ange Martinez for a quick second to thank Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring today's Law and Crime news package. It's stories like this that remind you you never know what's going to happen, and the world is an unpredictable place. So when you're hurt, it can be confusing, scary, and you don't know where to turn. Enter Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm. With them, you can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less on your phone to find out if you have a case. The past couple of months, they've gotten verdicts of $12 million, $6.8 million, and $26 million. So if you've ever been injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. Start a claim in 8 clicks or less without having to leave your couch. Now, back to our story. Maury's mom told local TV stations her daughter was picked up by a man she didn't know, what she believes is strange. However, according to law enforcement, that man isn't a person of interest. But the timeline to all this is important too. Maury's mom last saw her on August 17th, 2023. They spent the day relaxing and catching up, getting sushi, and going to see the Barbie movie. It was days later, on August 21st, when Maury texted her mom saying she no longer needed a ride. She texted Maury that night, and it was read at about 10 p.m., but there was never a response. That was the last day anyone saw her. But Maury wasn't reported missing for 7 more days. Another aspect of this case is that she was first reported missing back in August, so this is almost a year ago now, but there's kind
Mm,
of a distance between when she was last seen. So she was last seen on August 21st and then
right.
reported missing on August 28th. So that's about a week. Do you think that lapse in time could have made things even more difficult for investigators working to track her down?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we work in I always talk about this. We work in linear time. The idea that we start at point A and then take it out to infinity. And there's a reason why the old television program, The First 48, is significant. That title in and of itself speaks volumes because that's that golden period of time. And the further out down that continuum you move, uh, and for every sweep of the hand on the clock, you're losing little bits of evidence along the way. Now, that can be either digital, perhaps it can be biological representations, it can be people's memories. Because let's just say that she had been on the road and but with someone, and they pulled into a convenience store or something. Well, because there was such a delay, that person that may have borne witness to that, I'm not saying that this happened, but it's an example of something that can happen. They're not going to remember this young woman, particularly, as things get fuzzier, we move further, and everybody can identify with that. You think you remember all those things that have occurred in your past, and you might, but over a period of time, they've gotten muddled and changed. So that pinpoint accuracy is critical here. And boy, if you're absent that, you're absent a huge bit of data.
Then there's the location discrepancy. She was last seen in Georgia, and her remains are found 100 miles away, all the way in
Yeah.
Tennessee. So
Yep.
obviously, there was some sort of travel going on, whether it's
Oh
while
yeah.
she's still alive or after she's passed. Do you think that this is her going missing on her own accord, or could something more nefarious be at play?
Well, if she's getting a ride with somebody, if that is truly a valid statement, then um, why would somebody be in Georgia and then at this particular complex and be purposed to drive all the way to Tennessee? You know, which is striking to me in this particular case. You know, when I first heard about this case, I was thinking, well, this is going to be a local kind of event, but now you've crossed state lines, and guess who you've involved at this point in time? If this is a kidnapping or you've got the feds involved now, so they're going to have the full resources of the feds at their disposal to do as much of a deep dive as they possibly can. And you know, all you have to do is have that idea of kidnapping potentially come up in this conversation. Feds are going to be all in on this. And even with all of their resources, though, you can't conjure up answers without substantive scientific basis, and that's the rub here. We're back to the skeleton. If there is nothing remaining on that skeleton that would give you, an indication of what had occurred, um, then you're going to have to rely more on the circumstantial information that's going to be coming in.
Since identifying Maury's remains, experts have come to another curious conclusion. Investigators are saying there's no signs of trauma or major injury. And I'm
Right.
wondering, is that because there has been so much decay or there just weren't signs of it at all?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The reality is this: is that once you're down to, our skeletal structure, when you think about, our framework, as it were, skeleton, we can learn a lot from it: age, sex, race, these sorts of things. But when it comes to soft tissue trauma, if we think about things like, say, for instance, strangulation, we think about perhaps if someone was suffocated, or what if somebody overdosed? You're not going to have that sourcing information. It's gone. Uh, and you can have a fatal event that displays itself in the soft tissue, but yet there's not going to be any connectivity with the underlying bony structures. Say, for instance, if someone is in fact asphyxiated in some way, there's not going to be communication between the marks that we might, for instance, find on a neck, petechiae in the eyes. There's not going to be any kind of communication between that and the underlying skeletal structure. So it it's not surprising that they would come to that conclusion over the course of my career, working with skeletal remains. Most of the time, the investigators, the medical examiner, even, you're kind of left scratching your head in the end.
So, will that make it more difficult to determine how she died and whether anyone was involved? If there is, in fact, a suspect, could that make things even more tricky?
Yes, yes. This this route is fraught with unpredictable outcomes here. Because if you cannot move forward, as tragic as this case is, if you cannot move forward with something substantive, the DA is that their hands are tied at this point in time. Because first off, what are you going to call this? The medical examiner, are they going to classify it as a homicide, or will it be the big U, as we refer to it, undetermined? And that frustrates a lot of people. But you can't just willy nilly, just randomly say, "Oh yeah, well this was in fact a homicide," because you don't have anything scientifically to hang your proverbial hat on. And it's very frustrating for families as well, because they want to know. And in this particular case, unless they can find something in the underlying bony structures, and I'll kind of tell you how forensics plays into this. One of the things with careful examination that would happen, is that those scientists, forensic anthropologists, for instance, that examine bones, they're going to be looking for things like tool marks, perhaps some kind of evidence of gunfire injury. Um, and one more interesting point to this is that if the body has been down this long, to the point where skeletonization has taken place, unfortunately, you might have missing elements of the skeleton, and that can come about just in the natural process. of scavengers in the animal world that show up, and it's very, very frustrating.
But investigators still have more places they can search for clues.
One other piece to this that's very uh, intellectually stimulating for me. We've talked about skeletal remains. I want to know what was with her as far as clothing goes. I want to know about shoes. I want to know about underwear. I want to know about, you know, the pants. What were the status of the pants? Were they still buttoned? Were they open? Was there a belt involved? Or was the clothing missing? I think people think that when bodies decompose, that clothing just disappears. Did you know that many times, particularly if you're talking about synthetics, things that are man-made, they'll be far more resilient. I've worked cases before where I have had very little skeletal remnant left behind, but I will have had a synthetic based garment that is still underlying the area where the body had initially been placed. Want to know about the clothing, any kind of personal items that are there, and I hope that they did a really deep dive there at the scene, exploring that area.
I know we've talked throughout this entire interview about how we have a lot of unanswered questions about the case. Still, many things are left up in the air. Do you think it's possible for these things to be answered?
Yeah, well, the likelihood with every single day lessens. And there is a potential. Again, they're going to have to do a deep dive into the electronics. Keep in mind, uh, we do have her in contact with her mother, and that's certainly interesting, isn't it? Because I don't think that there's probably any payphones around there, so that would lead me to believe or conclude that she had, you know, a handheld device that she was speaking to her mother on. How deep have they gone into the electronic breadcrumbs, as I like to refer to them, relative to her movement? And also, if if they know specifically her phone identifier, did that phone move? Did it go anywhere? You know, heading northbound out of Georgia toward Tennessee, was it tracking all along? Can they dig back into that data? And I think that that's probably where the answers are going to rest here in this case. I hope that they do find some resolution in this case, because it's one of the most frustrating things you can do as an investigator is have no answers for the family, and particularly when you consider that the evidence has been so greatly diminished at this point.
From here, Maury's death continues to be investigated by Cobb and Gwinnett counties in Georgia and Hamilton County in Tennessee. If you have any information about her death, contact any of those agencies. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.